The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble steps of the National Memorial as hundreds of visitors began gathering for the daily ceremony. Among them stood Marcus Thompson, a 28-year-old Marine veteran whose weathered face told stories of 3 tours in Afghanistan. His prosthetic left leg, hidden beneath his worn jeans, was a constant reminder of the IED explosion that had changed his life forever. Marcus had driven 4 hours from his small apartment in rural Virginia to be here today. It wasn't his first visit to the memorial, but something felt different this time. The nightmares had been getting worse lately, and his therapist had suggested that facing his past might help him find peace. He clutched a folded photograph in his pocket, his best friend Jake, who hadn't made it home from their last mission together. The crowd began to quiet as the changing of the guard ceremony was about to begin. Marcus watched as the royal guards, dressed in their pristine uniforms, marched with perfect precision toward their posts. These weren't American soldiers, but visiting ceremonial guards from Britain, part of a special international honor ceremony that happened only once a year. Their red tunics and tall black hats made them look like something from a storybook, but Marcus knew that beneath those decorative uniforms were real soldiers, just like he had been. As the ceremony progressed, Marcus felt his chest tighten. The crisp commands, the synchronized movements, the absolute discipline. It all brought back memories he had tried so hard to bury. He remembered standing guard duty himself, the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. Knowing that lives depended on his alertness and dedication. One of the royal guards, a young man who couldn't have been more than 25, took his position directly in front of where Marcus was standing. The guard's eyes were fixed straight ahead, his face emotionless, his body perfectly still. But something in his posture reminded Marcus of himself during those long, lonely nights on watch in the desert. The crowd was taking pictures, chattering quietly, treating the ceremony like a tourist attraction. But Marcus saw something different. He saw a young soldier doing his duty, maintaining honor and tradition, just as Marcus had once done. The memories flooded back, the pride, the brotherhood, the sense of purpose that had defined his life before everything went wrong. As minutes passed, Marcus noticed something that no one else seemed to see. The young royal guard's hand was trembling slightly. It was barely noticeable, just the faintest shake in his white-gloved fingers. But Marcus recognized it immediately. He had felt that same tremor during his own difficult moments on duty, the weight of representing something bigger than yourself, the pressure of maintaining perfect composure even when your world was falling apart inside. Marcus took a step closer to the rope barrier that separated the crowd from the guards. Other visitors continued their casual conversations and picture-taking, but Marcus felt a deep connection forming with this young soldier. They were from different countries, different generations, different wars, but they shared something that civilians could never understand: the burden of service, the sacrifice of putting duty before self. The young guard's breathing seemed slightly labored now, though he maintained his rigid posture. Marcus recognized the signs of someone fighting an internal battle while trying to maintain external composure. Perhaps it was the heat, perhaps it was personal stress, or perhaps it was something deeper, the kind of struggle that every soldier faces when the weight of responsibility becomes almost too much to bear. Without thinking, Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out the folded photograph of Jake. He looked at his friend's smiling face, remembering the last conversation they had shared before that fatal patrol. Jake had talked about honor, about serving something greater than yourself, about the bond between soldiers that transcended everything else. The crowd around Marcus continued to mill about, oblivious to the silent drama unfolding before them. Children pointed at the guard's tall hat, tourists debated the best angle for photos, and guides recited historical facts in monotone voices. But Marcus saw only the young soldier, standing alone in his duty, carrying invisible burdens that only another warrior could recognize. Marcus made a decision that would change everything. He carefully folded the photograph and placed it back in his pocket. Then, slowly and deliberately, he straightened his shoulders and stood at attention. His military training, dormant for years, suddenly came flooding back. His spine became ramrod straight, his chin lifted, his arms fell naturally to his sides in perfect military bearing. The transformation was remarkable. The broken veteran disappeared, replaced by the proud Marine he had once been. Despite his civilian clothes, despite his hidden disability, despite his years away from service, Marcus stood with the bearing and dignity of a soldier. He wasn't mocking the ceremony or trying to draw attention to himself. He was offering something far more profound: recognition, respect, and solidarity from one warrior to another. The young royal guard noticed immediately. Though he couldn't turn his head or acknowledge Marcus directly, his eyes shifted slightly, making contact with the American veteran. In that moment, something passed between them, an understanding that transcended words, nationality, and circumstance. The guard's trembling stopped, his breathing steadied, and his posture somehow became even more perfect. Other people in the crowd began to notice the strange scene unfolding. Conversations gradually died down as visitors turned to look at the American man standing rigidly at attention beside the rope barrier. Some seemed confused, others annoyed by what they perceived as a disruption to their tourist experience. But a few, particularly the older visitors who might have been veterans themselves, began to understand what they were witnessing. Marcus held his position, his eyes locked with those of the young guard. The pain in his prosthetic leg was growing intense, and sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. But he refused to move. This wasn't about his comfort or his pain. This was about honoring a fellow soldier, acknowledging shared sacrifice, and bridging the gap between two warriors from different worlds. The minutes stretched on, and the crowd grew larger and more restless. Security personnel began to take notice of the unusual situation. A few guards exchanged glances, unsure whether this constituted a disruption that required intervention. The atmosphere became tense as more and more people realized that something significant was happening, even if they didn't fully understand what it was. Marcus could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes upon him, but his focus never wavered from the young royal guard. He thought about all the soldiers who had stood guard before them, all the men and women who had sacrificed comfort and safety to protect others. He thought about Jake, about his fallen comrades, about the invisible wounds that so many veterans carried home from war. The guard, meanwhile, seemed to draw strength from Marcus's presence. His stance became even more proud, his bearing more dignified. It was as if the silent support of a fellow warrior had reminded him of the nobility of his duty and the honor of his service. The trembling that had threatened to overcome him was completely gone now, replaced by a sense of purpose and connection. As the ceremony continued around them, Marcus and the royal guard maintained their wordless communication. They had become the center of an incredible moment. Two soldiers, separated by an ocean and united by honor, creating something beautiful and powerful in the midst of an ordinary day. The crowd sensed the significance of what they were witnessing, even if they couldn't fully comprehend it. The morning sun climbed higher, casting new shadows across the memorial grounds. The formal ceremony was drawing to a close. But the real ceremony, the one between Marcus and the guard, was just reaching its peak. Neither man showed any sign of breaking their connection, their shared moment of recognition and respect that had transformed an ordinary changing of the guard into something extraordinary. The crowd had fallen completely silent now, sensing that they were witnessing something rare and precious. Even the most casual tourists seemed to understand that this was no ordinary interaction. Phones were lowered, conversation stopped, and everyone watched in respectful silence as two warriors honored each other across the invisible barriers of nationality, generation, and circumstance. The silence that had fallen over the memorial grounds was unlike anything the regular staff had ever witnessed. Dr. Sarah Chen, a military historian who worked at the memorial, had been giving tours for over 15 years, but she had never seen visitors react this way to the changing of the guard ceremony. She watched from her position near the information booth as the American veteran and the British Royal Guard maintained their extraordinary silent exchange. Dr. Chen recognized something special was happening. Her own father had been a Vietnam veteran, and she had grown up understanding the unspoken language that existed between soldiers. She quietly radioed her supervisor, asking that no one interrupt what was taking place. This wasn't a security threat or a disruption. It was something far more meaningful. Among the crowd, an elderly woman named Ruth Williams felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. She had been visiting the memorial with her teenage granddaughter Emma, who had been complaining about the boring ceremony just minutes before. Now Emma stood transfixed, her phone forgotten in her hand, watching the incredible scene unfold before them. Ruth's late husband had been a World War II veteran who rarely spoke about his experiences in the Pacific Theater, but she remembered the way his face would change whenever he encountered other veterans. A kind of recognition and respect that seemed to bypass all normal social conventions. She was seeing that same phenomenon now, magnified and made visible for everyone to witness. Emma, despite her initial disinterest in the ceremony, found herself deeply moved by what she was seeing. At 17, she had never really understood what military service meant or why people made such sacrifices. But watching this wordless conversation between two soldiers from different countries and different generations, she began to grasp something profound about duty, honor, and the bonds that connect people who have served something greater than themselves. The Royal Guard, whose name was James Mitchell, had been struggling with his own demons that morning. Just 3 weeks earlier, he had returned from a deployment in Afghanistan, where he had lost 2 close friends in a roadside bombing. The ceremonial duties that had once filled him with pride now felt empty and meaningless. He had been questioning whether his service mattered, whether the sacrifices were worth it, whether anyone truly understood what soldiers went through. But as he stood there, drawing strength from the unwavering support of the American veteran, James felt something shift inside him. This stranger, this man who owed him nothing and knew nothing about his struggles, was offering him the most precious gift one warrior could give another: recognition, respect, and solidarity. The trembling that had threatened to overwhelm him earlier was completely gone now, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose and dignity. Marcus, meanwhile, was fighting his own battle. The pain in his prosthetic leg was becoming excruciating, and the emotional weight of the moment was bringing back memories he had tried to suppress. But every time he thought about breaking his stance, he looked into the young guard's eyes and saw something that kept him standing: gratitude, strength, and a recognition that this moment mattered more than his personal discomfort. A small group of other veterans in the crowd began to recognize what was happening. Without any verbal communication, they too straightened their postures and stood more formally. First one, then another, then several more men and women began to adopt more respectful stances, creating a growing circle of silent support around the central figures of Marcus and James. Tom Rodriguez, a Navy veteran who had served in Desert Storm, felt compelled to stand taller as he watched the incredible display. He had been struggling with his own post-service adjustment, working a series of unfulfilling jobs and feeling disconnected from the sense of purpose that had once defined his life. But seeing Marcus's courage in making this public gesture of respect reminded him of the values that had originally drawn him to service. Maria Santos, an Air Force veteran who had recently returned from her second deployment in the Middle East, found herself unconsciously moving closer to the other veterans in the crowd. She had been feeling isolated since coming home, struggling to connect with civilians who couldn't understand her experiences. But here, in this moment of shared recognition, she felt the bonds of military brotherhood and sisterhood that had sustained her through the darkest moments of deployment. The crowd of tourists began to sense that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Phone cameras that had been raised to capture routine photos were slowly lowered as people realized that some moments were too sacred to photograph. Conversations died away completely as the weight of the silent exchange between Marcus and James settled over everyone present. Children who had been restless and bored just minutes earlier now stood quietly beside their parents, somehow understanding that something important was happening even if they couldn't articulate what it was. The usual noise of a busy tourist attraction, the chatter, the footsteps, the mechanical sounds of cameras, faded away until only the soft whisper of wind through the memorial's trees could be heard. Security personnel who had initially been concerned about a potential disruption now found themselves serving as protective guardians of the moment. Captain Williams, the head of memorial security and himself a former Army officer, made sure that no one interfered with what was taking place. He recognized the significance of what he was seeing and was determined to preserve its integrity. The memorial's maintenance staff, many of whom were veterans themselves, quietly suspended their routine activities to watch the extraordinary scene. Groundskeeper Robert Hayes, who had served in Vietnam, felt a deep pride welling up inside him as he witnessed this spontaneous display of military honor and mutual respect. As the minutes continued to pass, the physical strain on both Marcus and James became increasingly evident. Marcus's face showed the effort it was taking to maintain his position despite his disability, while James continued to hold his ceremonial pose with even greater precision than before. But neither man showed any intention of breaking the connection they had established. The emotional intensity of the moment was affecting everyone present. Even the most casual tourists began to understand that they were witnessing something rare and beautiful, a moment of pure human connection that transcended politics, nationality, and circumstance. Some visitors were moved to tears as they watched these two soldiers honor each other across the divide that separated them. Dr. Chen found herself thinking about all the history these memorial grounds had witnessed over the years, the formal ceremonies, the visiting dignitaries, the countless tourists who had come and gone. But she knew that what was happening now was different. More powerful and more meaningful than any official event she had ever seen. The young Royal Guard's fellow soldiers, maintaining their own positions around the memorial, began to understand what their colleague was experiencing. Though they couldn't break their own ceremonial poses, their bearing became more proud, their stances more perfect, as they drew inspiration from the incredible display of international military brotherhood taking place before them. Marcus thought about Jake again, about all the conversations they had shared about what it meant to serve. Jake had always believed that the bonds between soldiers were sacred, that the recognition of shared sacrifice was one of the most important things one warrior could offer another. Standing here now, offering that recognition to a young soldier from another country, Marcus felt closer to his fallen friend than he had in years. The crowd had grown even larger as word spread through the memorial complex about the extraordinary scene taking place at the guard post. But rather than creating chaos or disruption, the growing audience seemed to enhance the solemnity and significance of the moment. People instinctively formed respectful boundaries around the central figures, creating a natural amphitheater for this spontaneous ceremony of honor. James felt strength flowing through him that he hadn't experienced in weeks. The doubts and questions that had been plaguing him since his return from deployment began to fade as he drew energy from this unexpected source of support and understanding. This American veteran, this stranger who had every reason to simply enjoy his visit and move on, had chosen instead to offer him something invaluable, the recognition that his service mattered, that his sacrifices were seen and respected. The morning sun had climbed higher now, and the formal changing of the guard ceremony had officially concluded. But the real ceremony, the wordless conversation between two warriors, continued without interruption. Both men seemed to understand that they had created something special together, something that neither wanted to end prematurely. The time had come for the royal guards to complete their ceremonial rotation, but something unprecedented was about to happen. James Mitchell, the young British soldier who had been drawing strength from Marcus's unwavering support, faced a moment that would define his entire military career. According to strict protocol, he should execute a perfect about-face and march to his next position without acknowledging the crowd in any way. But as the moment arrived, James made a decision that would be remembered by everyone present for the rest of their lives. Instead of simply following standard procedure, he did something that had never been done before in the history of ceremonial guard duty at this memorial. With perfect military precision, he brought his rifle to present arms, the highest form of military salute, and held it directly toward Marcus. The crowd gasped audibly. This was not part of any ceremony or protocol. This was a spontaneous act of recognition from one warrior to another, a gesture that transcended every rule and regulation about ceremonial behavior. The present arms salute, traditionally reserved for high-ranking officers and heads of state, was being offered by a young British soldier to an American veteran in civilian clothes who had shown him unexpected solidarity in a moment of need. Marcus felt his breath catch in his throat as he realized what was happening. Tears began to stream down his face as he understood the magnitude of the gesture being offered to him. Without hesitation, he brought his right hand to his forehead in the sharpest, most perfect salute he had ever rendered. His prosthetic leg might have limited his mobility, but his salute was flawless, a testament to the military bearing that lived on within him despite his wounds. The two men held their salutes for what felt like an eternity, creating a bridge of honor between nations, generations, and experiences. The British soldier in his pristine ceremonial uniform and the American veteran in his simple civilian clothes had created something beautiful together, a moment of pure military brotherhood that spoke to the highest ideals of service and sacrifice. The crowd was completely silent now, many people openly weeping as they witnessed this extraordinary exchange. Dr. Chen found herself crying as she thought about her father and all the veterans who had never received the recognition they deserved. Emma, the teenager who had been bored by the ceremony just an hour earlier, felt her entire understanding of military service shift as she watched these two men honor each other with such profound dignity. Ruth Williams squeezed her granddaughter's hand as they watched together, both women understanding that they were witnessing something that would stay with them forever. The elderly woman thought about her late husband and wished he could have experienced a moment like this, a public recognition of the bonds that connected all those who had served their countries with honor. The other veterans in the crowd stood transfixed, many of them saluting as well as they felt themselves becoming part of something larger than any individual ceremony. Tom Rodriguez, Maria Santos, and dozens of other former service members found themselves standing taller, their own sense of pride and purpose renewed by what they were witnessing. After what seemed like forever, James slowly brought his rifle back to its standard position and executed a perfect about-face. But before he marched away, he did something else that broke every rule in the ceremonial manual. He turned his head slightly and made direct eye contact with Marcus one final time. The look they exchanged spoke volumes about respect, gratitude, and the unbreakable bonds that connect warriors across all boundaries. As James marched away with perfect precision, Marcus slowly lowered his salute, but remained standing at attention. The crowd seemed to understand that the moment wasn't quite over yet, that something more was needed to properly conclude this extraordinary exchange, and then, without any prompting or organization, something magical began to happen. One person began to clap, then another, then another. Within seconds, the entire crowd was applauding, not the polite, tourist-friendly applause that usually followed ceremonial events, but deep, emotional appreciation for what they had just witnessed. The applause grew and grew until it filled the entire memorial complex, a thunderous recognition of the courage, dignity, and honor that both men had displayed. Marcus finally broke his stance, and the physical exhaustion hit him all at once. His legs nearly gave out, but strong hands caught him. Other veterans in the crowd who had moved forward to support their brother. As they helped steady him, Marcus looked around at the faces surrounding him and saw something he hadn't experienced in years: acceptance, understanding, and respect from people who truly comprehended what he had been through. The crowd began to disperse slowly, many people approaching Marcus to thank him for what he had done. But the words seemed inadequate compared to the power of what had just taken place. Children who had witnessed the exchange peppered their parents with questions about soldiers and service and why the moment had been so important. Emma Williams found herself walking over to Marcus, her grandmother beside her. The teenager looked at the veteran with new eyes, seeing not just a man with hidden wounds, but a person who had served something greater than himself and had found the courage to honor a fellow soldier in public, despite his own pain and struggles. "Thank you," Emma said simply, her voice thick with emotion. "I understand now." Marcus looked at the young woman and saw something hopeful in her eyes, a recognition of service and sacrifice that hadn't been there an hour earlier. "Your generation gives me hope," he replied quietly. "Maybe the things we fought for weren't in vain after all." Dr. Chen approached with several other memorial staff members, all of them deeply moved by what they had witnessed. "In all my years here," she said to Marcus, "I've never seen anything like that. You created something beautiful today, something that reminded all of us what honor looks like." As Marcus prepared to leave the memorial, he was surprised to see James Mitchell approaching in civilian clothes, his ceremonial duty completed for the day. The young British soldier walked directly to Marcus and extended his hand. "I needed that today more than you know," James said, his voice quiet but steady. "I've been struggling since I got back from Afghanistan, questioning whether any of it mattered. What you did out there reminded me of why I serve." Marcus shook the young man's hand firmly, feeling a connection that went beyond words. "We all struggle sometimes," he replied. "But what you did today, breaking protocol to honor a fellow soldier, that took real courage. Your friends who didn't make it home would be proud." The two men talked for nearly an hour, sharing stories about their service, their struggles, and their hopes for the future. Other veterans joined the conversation, creating an impromptu support group right there on the memorial grounds. The bonds that had been forged during the wordless confrontation continued to grow stronger through shared conversation and mutual understanding. As the afternoon sun began to set, Marcus finally prepared to make the long drive back to his small apartment in Virginia. But he was no longer the same broken man who had arrived that morning. The courage he had found to honor a fellow soldier had somehow helped heal something inside himself. The photograph of Jake in his pocket no longer felt like a burden of guilt, but like a reminder of the brotherhood that death could not destroy. James returned to his quarters that evening with a renewed sense of purpose. The doubts and questions that had been plaguing him since his return from deployment had not disappeared entirely, but they had been overshadowed by something stronger. A connection to the larger community of warriors who understood his sacrifices and honored his service. The story of what happened that day spread quickly through social media and news outlets, but the viral videos and articles could never capture the true power of what had taken place. It wasn't just about a veteran and a guard saluting each other. It was about the moment when two human beings chose honor over comfort, recognition over indifference, and connection over isolation. Dr. Chen made sure that the memorial's official records included a detailed account of the extraordinary event. She wanted future historians to understand that some of the most meaningful moments in military history happen not during great battles or formal ceremonies, but in quiet instances when individuals chose to honor each other with dignity and respect. Months later, Marcus received a letter from Emma Williams, the teenager who had witnessed the exchange. She was applying to military academies, inspired by what she had seen that day to consider a career in service. Her letter thanked him for showing her that honor wasn't just an abstract concept, but something that could be lived and demonstrated in everyday moments. James Mitchell was awarded a commendation from his commanding officer for his actions that day, despite having technically violated ceremonial protocol. The citation read that he had demonstrated the highest ideals of military service by recognizing and honoring a fellow warrior, showing that true discipline sometimes meant making difficult choices based on honor rather than rigid adherence to rules. The memorial itself seemed changed by what had happened there. Visitors often asked staff members about the day when an American veteran and a British guard had created an unforgettable moment of military brotherhood. The story became part of the memorial's informal history, passed down from tour guides to visitors as an example of what honor looked like in action. Marcus continued to visit the memorial regularly, but now he came not as a broken veteran seeking healing, but as a man who had found peace through serving others. He often spoke with young veterans who were struggling with their own transitions to civilian life, sharing the lesson he had learned that day, that the bonds of military brotherhood were stronger than any individual pain or struggle. The wordless confrontation between a Marine veteran and a Royal Guard had lasted less than an hour, but its impact rippled outward for months and years. It reminded everyone who witnessed it that in a world often divided by politics, nationality, and ideology, there remained something powerful and unifying about recognizing and honoring those who had chosen to serve something greater than themselves. In the end, the greatest victory was not the viral fame or the media attention, but the simple fact that two warriors had found exactly what they needed in an unexpected moment of connection. The recognition that their service mattered, their sacrifices were seen, and their brotherhood transcended every boundary that might have separated them.